Okay, great. All right, welcome to our second installment for the year of the Translation Talks series. These are very short Zoom conversations with the goal of bringing faculty together from across the UC campuses who are thinking about language in creative ways. And we use as an excuse um, outside people who have something to share about language and poetry. So it's really a pleasure to see all of you here. We are recording this. We will send it on to our colleagues at the UC Humanities Research Institute at Irvine to share on their webpage later. And please stay tuned because we're trying to have one of these each quarter for the foreseeable future. I am Amelia Glazer. I'm the director of the Institute for Arts and Humanities at UC San Diego, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Ainsley Morse, my colleague in the Department of Literature in Slavic, but also in translation studies to give the introductions to our speakers.
Thank you, Amelia, and thanks to everybody who came to present and to listen. Um, I'm just going to introduce our three speakers this morning. We're going to begin with Eugene Ostashevsky, who will give who will start us out with some thoughts about translation and writing, and then we'll have a discussion, and we should have some time at the end for questions from those of you who have come to listen. So Eugene Ostashevsky is a poet and translator who works with linguistic multiplicity and interference. He is the semi-author of Alphabet Soup. Hang on. We just got it. It's hot off the presses. So he is the semi-author of Alphabet Soup, the translingual sayings of Emma and Eva as recorded by their father, a collection of utterances by language-mixing young persons. His recent books of poetry, The Feeling Sonnets and The Pirate Who Does Not Know the Value of Pi, examine the effects of speaking a non-native language on affects and identity. He has won the National Translation Award, the Best Translated Book Award, and the City of Münster International Poetry Prize. And he teaches for the Liberal Studies program at NYU. I will add that if you are in San Diego, Eugene is going to read this evening in the UCSD New Writing series at 5 o'clock. So don't miss that. I can put an announcement about it in the chat in a minute. So Eugene is going to be in conversation with Jennifer Tseng and Michael Davidson. Jennifer is an award-winning poet, fiction writer, and essayist whose work explores identity, family, and cultural inheritance. She is the author of the acclaimed novel Mayumi and the Sea of Happiness, the flash fiction collection The Passion of Woo Isolde, and multiple poetry collections, with her essay collection Mixed Feelings forthcoming this year. Tseng is currently Associate Professor of Literature and Creative Writing at UC Santa Cruz. And Michael Davidson is a distinguished scholar, poet, and critic whose work spans modern American literature, poetry, cultural studies, gender studies, and disability studies. A leading voice in American literary scholarship, he is the author of influential books including Invalid Modernism and Distressing Language, Disability, and the Poetics of Error, as well as several acclaimed poetry collections. He is Distinguished Professor Emeritus in the Literature Department at UC San Diego, where his work has profoundly shaped conversations on modern poetry, disability poetics, and the intersections of race, gender, and literary form. So we're really grateful to all three of you for being here, and we look forward to hearing from you. I'm going to give the floor to Eugene to start us off.
Great. Thank you, Ansley. So I'm gonna start with a statement that's actually I prepared in advance. So in part, I'll be reading it. I'll try not to read it. Um, but I wrote it up because it's a lot of things, and I want some conciseness. For me, it's a huge honor and a big deal to be appearing here with Michael Davidson, because his landing of Rochambeau was very important for, I don't know, my personal development. I came upon it really accidentally um, in the 90s in a bookstore in San Francisco in an anthology. Um, and it taught me the way that our representations of history are inextricable from history. It was just very important for my thinking about, I don't know, the relationship between words and things, which is something that I've been thinking about for really my whole life. So, and I want to talk about um, uh, Michael's work from a much more recent period. Um, his distressing language disability and the poetics of error in relationship to some of the stuff I've been thinking about translingualism. So Michael's distressing language lies at the intersection between disability studies, especially deaf studies, um, and and poetic concerns that stem from the historical avant-garde, from the avant-garde in the beginning of the 20th century, which I also happen to study academically. Um, the book offers a poetics of communication through interference, hindrance, resistance, difficulty. Um, the result being rife with noise, with chance, with errors, and um, the noise introduces an opportunity for unpremeditated creation, and also for subversive reflection on the power relations that are inherent in communication. The title plays on the multiple meaning of distressing, so language that is upsetting for somebody, language that uh, is itself being made upset, being made anxious, or language that is fraying, that is coming apart. The book celebrates, I quote, language that roughens the surface, effaces clarity, dissolves in puns and homonyms, offers a kind of verbal static that interrupts linear communication and calls attention to the frangible nature of language itself. The poetics is grounded in personal experience of communication difficulties arising from the gradual onset of deafness, combined with lack of native level familiarity with sign language. So it draws on disability studies, but it's also a remarkably evocative subversion of mimesis and the undermining of reference, which is something that that was the big avant-garde project, subversion of mimesis, undermining of reference. The point of the historical avant-garde, by which I mean the Picasso group, and onwards, so 1910s basically, is the obfuscation of the what in art in order to call attention to the how. Avant-garde artists did not want to look at a painting of apples and say, wow, look at those apples. They wanted people to look at it and be like, wow, look at that painting. And so they made it difficult to see apples as apples, right? And there were various techniques for making it difficult. Reading Davidson, I was thinking of some of the people that I've worked on. This guy, Igor Terentiev, who was a member of the Dada-like university 41 Degrees in Tbilisi, in Georgia, in 1919, one of whose slogans was «Когда нет ошибки, ничего нет», which means that when there's no mistake, there's just nothing happening at all. In the same way, uh, later Russian language avant-garde poets that both Ansley and I work on um, thought of errors, of mistakes as the kind of really the beginning of the creation process. But even before that, there was a futurist concept of the zdvig, the dislocation, a very, very rich concept which came out of writings about Cubism. And when it applied to poetry, it referred to language moves that evoked double takes in the reader. So you think you're reading one thing, and then at a certain point, you realize that you are reading something completely different. So it's basically a kind of approach to the pun, a kind of worship of the pun. And this is where I come in. And I'm thinking that it's possible to reconcile distressing language with my take on translingualism, which is certainly not my term. It's a term that has lots of different uses in a whole bunch of fields, not just poetry. But it's something that I've been thinking about for years, in part because, I don't know, I mean, I was born in the Soviet Union. I grew up in the States. I live mainly in Germany, so I get to be between languages a lot. So um, my thinking about translingualism, I think, goes very well into the frame of Michael's thinking about language, because both employ the ideas of the historical avant-garde to fashion a poetics of communication made difficult, which distrusts the transparency claims of language, which regards them skeptically as disguised forms of power asymmetry, of asymmetrical power assertion. I should say that in the case of my version of translingualism, hindered communication doesn't really arise out of disability per se. So there might be something problematic about the bringing those concepts together. But I do want to try thinking it through. So originally, I took on the label of translingualism in poetry when I moved to Germany, and there was just pressure on me to explain what I do and why my poetry is not, normal. And originally, I applied it to texts that employ more than one language without translating between the languages, which is a key feature. Later, I began to think, or rather, I was inspired by my friend, the German poet Uliane Wolf, to think that the second language does not need to be on the surface, does not need to be visible, that a translingual poem can be written only on one language, but that one surface language must be treated in a special way as one language in a multilingual world, in a world where many different languages are possible, where they're not semantically interchangeable with ease, where they're not translationally equivalent. And later on, I began to call that poetry translingual, which from a different angle, as a poetry that models the experience of finding yourself between languages, between cultures, or of being a language learner, of learning a new language, and fundamentally of speaking a language that is not your own, that you do not own, that is a strange language in some way, an alien language, and maybe an estranged language, for those of you who know something about Russian formalism. Translingual poetry is poetry that finds language strange. Um, so first, a few words about the underlying ideology, the underlying linguistic ideology. It's that of linguistic relativity, um, whose hard case in the US is called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, but basically, which is something that comes out of German Romanticism, and is kind of a simple assertion that, I don't know, the kind of language you speak influences, uh, doesn't determine, but has some say in what sort of things you think about and how. So it's very, I don't know, statistical. I think that people don't think in prepositions. I think they don't think in logical sequences that they dress up in whichever language comes along. I think that language can't really be fully sundered from culture. And in general, that words just stop being words if they're separated from meanings, and meanings are cultural. Um, and each language at any given point comes with its own network of concepts and, most importantly, of associations between them, especially so in poetry. So what this means basically is that the same thing said in different languages is not the same thing. Utterances don't translate from language to language seamlessly with no loss and with no gain. Each translation, rather, is a transformation, a metamorphosis. So for me, the first thing that translingualism must do is to call attention to the act of translation as a process where the output doesn't equal the input, where change happens. And this change always has to do with a change in point of view, a change in framing, and it's often an unpredictable change. So to place yourself between languages and cultures is to place yourself between the multiplicity of perspectives, and you don't really have ground for deciding which one is true. Another feature of translingualism for me is the foregrounding of metalinguistic questions. Like a person learning a new language, you're always saying, how do you say this? What does this mean? What a strange term in my language or in this other language. You say it very differently. You estrange the world of things by pointing to their linguistic frame. In general, in a translingual poem, you can't really talk about the world of things without talking about the world of things. Yeah, there's always the linguistic frame that's there. To foreground this frame, you estrange language by playing with texture, by introducing Stolpersteine, stumbling blocks, for slowing down the text flow. This can be done phonetically by choosing sound combinations that are challenging rather than mellifluous. This can be done with stresses, with sentence structure. There's a lot of expressive potential in disfluencies, but again, there's Stolpersteine, there's stumbling blocks. They remind the reader that language is material and that it has a mind of its own. My preferred stumbling block is putting together words that look or sound approximately the same, but they're semantically different. They mean different things. Or else by having the same word recur in a text, but shifting its meaning all the time. In general, I think my job, if I had to explain what is my task as a poet, and for me, that's simple. That's just to multiply meanings. And I do it by increasing the contextual ambivalence of the word, of the linguistic form, in order that more of its semantic values come out. Okay, Anstey will recognize this as pure Tinyanov. I mean, just so I pun both between languages and within English. I use words etymologically. I use what's called folk etymologies. Many of them are deliberately false. Many of them are jokes. In the same way that when I do translate in a text, I usually, I don't know, I usually put like ruses in. It's their fault. My translations, they're always false. Um, uh, in my own texts. So I said that one of the ways I was explaining translingualism to myself is via the scenario of speaking a language that's not your own, of finding yourself immersed in a foreign environment. As many of you know, when you're suddenly immersed in a foreign language, you feel incomprehension. It's frustrating, partial comprehension, but you feel kind of the limits of language to be very, very close to you. And in that sense, I certainly find incomprehension to be the driving feeling of my poetry. And I think in certain ways, as far as the foregrounding of linguistic materiality, of estrangement, of incomprehension, of stumbling blocks, that my translingualism fits into the frame provided by Michael's distressing language. But this is a very big but. The similarities, they're stylistic and they're tactical. As a poet, I don't even know what group I would represent. And I don't know like who I would speak for, right? And this is a very big difference between me and, many of the artists that Michael talks about. English is my second language. I do speak it with an accent. I often screw up in pronouncing things. You know, at the same time, it's my dominant language. It's nothing like the language of a recent immigrant. I don't know. I'm a literature professor at an American university. It's silly to say that.
What happened to sound?
But at the same time, in comprehension, disfluency, they're not side effects of just of translingualism. I mean, I don't know. And comprehension is something everyone can relate to. And in that sense, my model is heuristic. I don't think of translingualism and poetry as a property of specific class of persons. I don't think translingual poetry has to be written by second language speakers, but as a set of positions with respect to language, and positions that I, as an artist, pick of my own volition, if that makes sense, of my own free will. So that's pretty much my statement. It's a bit dense. I know I should have put in more jokes.
You still have time for jokes.
Okay, good.
Thank you so much, Zhenya, Eugene. I would love to hear some responses to start us off from Michael and from Jennifer. For those of you who've come in um, since we started, we are moving into the conversation part of this translation talk. So I very much welcome Michael and Jennifer to jump in, and then we should have some time toward the end for questions from our guests, our other guests.
Well, I'll start off since Eugene mentioned my work. What I find so exciting about translingualism is finding a parallel instance or a reconciliation, as he says, of what I call a poetics of error. He talks about the fact that working among different languages without trying to find an exact fit means that other and often discontinuous meanings are discovered, puns, homophones, false friends, and so forth. That in making language strange also discovers the richness of associations. He says in his paper that he feels that my idea about the poetics of error is perhaps different because different from translingualism, since it comes from the concern with hearing loss and disability. But I'm just wondering, Eugene, if we couldn't talk little bit about the ways in which the two phenomena, the idea of that when language breaks down and doesn't make sense, you learn something about language.
Right.
And that with disability or deafness, when the body breaks down, you learn something about what the world presumes to be a norm. So both of these are politically, and fundamentally very important because they remind us of a materiality of existence, which is both embodied and linguistic. So I'm just thinking that perhaps there's no need to differentiate these two areas, other than the fact that, in my case, I'm not a translator and I'm not fluent in ASL, although I'm learning. So perhaps we could talk a little bit about the relationship between the body and the language and the ways in which, when things don't work, we learn what they are.
Okay, so I think for me, I made that statement that it's perhaps not the same thing because it's very important. Well, I mean, one of probably the person with whom I'm in greatest dialogue about this, Juliana Wolf, is a translingual writer who works between German and English, and she's worked between German and Polish. But I mean, she's a native German speaker, right? So I constantly have an example of somebody who is doing really interesting work um, uh, with her language, but is making herself stumble. Does that make sense? Right? Is tripping herself up in order to see it as a foreign language. So I want to have that possibility. I mean, um, as far as stumbling, so I mean, I I actually I use the term stumbling block on purpose.
Mhm.
Um, stumbling blocks in German cities, they're the little bronze plaques with the name of Jews who were deported to Auschwitz or killed in some other way, and they're called stumbling blocks because, because of the way that the term is used in the Bible. Um, The idea being that you stumble over it, um, it gets in your way, and that's how you know it's there.
Yeah.
And this is certainly, um, the issue with, with the body breaking down, with hearing breaking down.
Mhm.
Um, but I think it's also, I don't know, I think it's a kind of thing that versions of this everybody finds, in their daily life, because ultimately everyone has a body and
Yeah.
ultimately everyone communicates. So both break down a lot,
Yeah.
unless you're very, very lucky or really unaware of yourself. But then you kind of don't go into poetry.
Yeah. Well, I think it's, of course, I'm a big fan of error because I make so many errors of understanding and so forth. And so when I read about translingualism, I say, yes, of course, this is a fundamental fact of language learning and also of translation. If you're always trying to find the exact fit, you're not going to appreciate the steps that you took to get where you are, the sort of temporality that happens in an act of translation, or in my case, in the act of trying to understand in these captions, which are notoriously inadequate. I have to fill in some blanks. And to me, that's a poetic activity. I think you capture all of that. You say at one point in the feeling sonnets, you say, "My body is multilingual. It sticks out its tongues, but they say the same thing." Ah, which I think that's a delicious haiku about our mutual issues here.
I was once, many, many years ago, I was in Toronto, I think at a conference. It was winter, it was snowy. I was staying at a friend's house and I was waiting for the bus outside. It was like really early in the morning. I hadn't slept well. And the bus came, and on the steps of the bus, I thought it said, "Bus lovers, watch your step." And I was like, "Bus lovers, wow, that is such a cool way that Canadian, in New York, it's like customers, blah, blah, blah." And only after the, only afterwards when I was getting off the bus, I saw that it said bus lowers. Like when it stops, it just lowers, right? So you need to watch your feet getting in. But yeah, that happens to me all the
Yeah, good.
Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
yeah,
I'm
jump in.
yeah, I'm gonna jump in. Thank you for that statement. It is dense, it's rich, and it's provocative. And there's so much that I'm curious about and want to know about. And somehow, I think if I could only ask you one thing, though, it would be why do you write?
I don't know. It was always there. I mean, uh, I always, I mean, I wrote silly poems as a kid, before immigrating. And then when I was 11 and we came to New York, um, somehow, mostly when kids come at that age, they uh, get absorbed by the receiving culture. Um, but somehow, I don't know, we came and we bought all of these books of poetry that you couldn't buy in the Soviet Union, like Mandelstam and Brodsky and da 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 da. So that's what I just read so much when I was a teenager. Um, and yeah, so there's no single why. It's just something that was always who I was. Um, and it took me many, many, many years of writing to be actually become myself. Um, to um, I don't know, to leave the Russian tradition, to leave the way that you think about the I, the self, the way that you think about language in that tradition. And in a way, when I found The Landing of Rochambeau in Messerly's anthology, that was a really big, um, that was a really big step for me. Um, yeah, but I mean, I've always written stuff.
Do you
So
think,
I don't know. I mean, I don't have a why. It's a bit like why am I me?
yeah, yeah, why are you? Well, do you think that I mean, according to your sort of working definition of translingual poetry, it doesn't necessarily have to have another language in it. And do you think that that has always been one of the things drawing you to poetry is translingual poetry, even as a kid before you had this other language?
I think so. I've always enjoyed reading poetry in weird languages, much more so than I enjoyed reading something that was, you know, direct and in fairly simple English. Or, I mean, simple whatever. So, like, I don't know, like when I was learning French in high school and college, I would be reading much older forms of French, which I didn't really entirely understand. But that not understanding part was a really big part of the poetic experience. And I mean, in general, that is so with foreign languages for me.
I have a question to follow up on that, because what what Michael just said about this, what Michael called the poetic activity of reading the garbled captions
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and making meaning out of them. It is, of course, also an intellectual activity, right? It is an interpretive activity. And on the way here today, you and I were talking about how these Russian formalist critics, who are so important for us, they're writing about literature generally, but for them, what literature really is like this very experimental futurist stuff that their friends are writing or that they themselves are writing at this time. And I just wonder if it's like, are we prepared? Are you prepared to kind of do what they do and say, this is poetry? Like this for me is really what poetry is this rather
I mean, this
demanding.
for me is what
Yeah,
poetry is.
this
But
this like kind of. Hmm.
I don't want to make the move and say it should be that for you.
Hmm.
I think poetry is anthropologically a really open activity.
Hmm.
And I think that many things that pass for poetry in one society would not pass for poetry in another society. So, I mean, the most obvious example is a lot of contemporary American poetry would just not be poetry in, I don't know, the Soviet Union of the 70s. Like nobody would see that as poetry. And if you insisted that it was poetry, they would just be surprised. Or, I don't know, if you look at oral composition, different kinds of oral composition, right? It's a very, very different process from, what one does working with computer writing thing
Hmm.
or with
Uh, Amelia, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I definitely want to jump in. This is really interesting to me. And Zhenya, I mean, first of all, it feels like what you're talking about partly is the queering of language and the queering of language through these means of mistakes, of changing things, of
yeah,
embracing the the strangeness. And I'm wondering whether this can apply to translation. A lot of my engagement with your work is through your translations. You're an amazing translator. We often seem to overlap in some of the poets that we translate. And I've been thinking lately about um, translation mistakes and what that does for this sort of afterlife of the meaning, and not intentional mistakes, right? Mistakes that we're embarrassed about, but that continue. And I don't know, I wonder if you could just talk about how this applies to the process of actual translation, right? Lexical translation between languages.
So I think that translation is also not one thing, but a whole grab bag. I think translating a living poet who has never been translated before and who needs the translation because the translation would get them out of, I don't know, where they are and be like a key to travel to residencies and receive prizes, right? Because English is a super powerful language. Being translated into English gives you things, right? If you're a living person. So I think that's kind of one genre of translation. I think translating canonical people is a very different genre of translation, or can be at least. Translating um, um, I'll give you an example. So right now, off and on, I'm translating Mikhail Semenko, right, the Ukrainian futurist. I don't really know Ukrainian. I mean, I find ways around that, but it can't really be compared to, I don't know, my knowledge of Russian, for example, right, which is on an entirely different level. Um, and um, and but I do know futurism, right? So if you put me in a room with a futurist poet from 1914, I have a pretty good idea of what they're going to be doing, no matter what language. But I still I keep asking myself, like, should I be doing this? Shouldn't I leave this for somebody whose Ukrainian is better? And the basic issue is, if there was such a person, I would gladly do it. But there is no such a person that I know of at the moment. So I think it's very important, in light of the present political situation, that people like Semenko get translated. And even though I can't do, the theoretically best possible translation that could be done, I think it's more important that a translation be done. And then somebody else can come along later and redo it. So I think with translation, the rules are, they change based on whom you're doing, what you're doing it for, when you're doing it. Mm-hmm. So it shifts all the time.
I think this question of what you're doing it for is an important aspect of translation. I'm thinking about the cultural meaning of translation for different constituencies. For example, interlingualism in Chicano poetry, in which you have English and Spanish without being translated necessarily back and forth, to illustrate the hegemony of English in Spanish American, Hispanic American context. And the other example that comes to mind is the problem of translating sign language poems, which
Mhm.
are poems, after all, that are signed on the body. And um, uh, and the syntax in ASL is very different from, say, English, although people assume it's just a gestural version of English. It's not that at all. So one time, the deaf poet Peter Cook was asked what would be the perfect translation model for ASL, and he said, well, a holograph would be, because a holograph would represent the body in its 360-degree space. And we could think of many other examples in which uh, translation attempts at fidelity must include the cultural meaning of translation for the constituencies for whom it's of value. And that's a very complicated bit of business.
Mhm.
And I think maybe translingualism is at least, one answer on a spectrum of what translation means for most people.
Can I just say I would rather it be a question on the spectrum than an answer. I mean, um, um, I think it's very, very very often when people think of translation, they think of it in a kind of very automatic way that this is something that is transparent,
Yeah,
that it's something, I guess they think it's something that can be done badly, but if you do it well, what you get is the original, and that's just not the case. You know, um, I mean, Peter Cook's answer in particular. I mean, I've seen Peter Cook read perform, um, and I've seen. I mean, I've seen stuff translated into sign also, um, and it's a completely different dynamic,
yeah,
right? And but here the comparison is maybe not with translating modern things into modern things, but with translating some forms of older poetry into doing it today. Because the stakes are very different in older poetry,
yeah,
right? Even the 19th century poetry with its classical meters, classical rhymes, just what you're doing, why you're doing it, um, uh, you know, what constitutes a poem. These are all um, very different things from the way that we think now. And this is why, for me as a translator, increasingly, um, scholarship is important. So for me, when I translate, especially older material, um, even though I translate as a poet,
yeah.
I I write commentary, I write introductions, um, I explain things,
Yeah.
and maybe that provides more dimensions.
I'll step in as moderator just to make sure that people who are zooming in can have their chance to ask a question
Mhm.
of our speakers today. And then if nobody has a burning question, we can just keep talking. But it'd be great
We,
to
I
hear.
think we do need to stop in like
Yeah,
10
yeah,
minutes.
yeah, we
I
will.
have to teach a
Yeah.
class.
Annika, do you
Uh,
have a question?
Hi, yes, I do. Thank you. This has been so interesting. Eugene, I stumbled across your essay last year. I'm an English as first language speaker, and I'm a really lousy second language speaker for both Japanese and Spanish. And
mhm.
I actually, at the time that I read your essay on translingualism, I was working on a biographical project, life writing, and I ended up thinking a lot about your notions of like high contrast and glossing when it applied to maybe the idea of like translating somebody's life. So often in like
Mhm.
biographies, what happens is that like the reader picks up a book and obviously reads and thinks that they're sort of like comprehending everything. The sense that you're really receiving the whole story. And I was really interested in what you talk about, the sort of like acts of interpretation being made legible. In a maybe like kind of metatextual, or you even describe like just today, like the sort of formal ways through syntax or other ways of like making the frame legible. I'm curious whether you how far you would sort of stretch maybe what could be considered translation. Um, and I was interested in your description or discussion of Michael's work because I know that brings in disability studies. But anyway, I was just wondering if you had any comments at all about how you might extend this towards thinking about biographical projects or life writing.
So, okay, so I've been working on this project for about a dozen years now. And it's a project on a book of Russian futurist poetry, which is published in 1914. And it's a visual poetry. It's a visual poetry book with a dozen poems, 7 of which are basically, they look like Cubist paintings. They're broken up on the page, and you don't know what the proper order for them is. And I was asked to do this by an artist in Chicago, who is also a historian of typography. And we did like what he calls a visual translation. So we did everything like the original, except it's in English. But then it didn't feel like it was enough. And I started reading about the guy, but also started reading about the things that he's writing about. And then it became kind of an addiction. I started looking at old newspapers from 1930, like old entertainment magazines, because a lot of his poems are about nightclubs in Moscow in January 1914. So, and then I realized that the book, which is called Tango with Cows, is actually about the tango revolution of 1913. And, you know, I'm still working on this. I mean, I've written articles about this. I published a book, and I'm doing like a portrait of a certain aspect of an era right before World War I came and put an end to it. But in a way, I feel like I'm doing a biography of a book. And I feel like I'm doing a translation. And a specific part of what we published was there's the translation. And then there's about 50 pages where I go through each poem, you know, basically every single Russian word of the poem, I provide it with an English explanation. And that's kind of like a thick translation of the work. So there are 2 parallel translations, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
So we are actually at time. We need to unfortunately let Jennifer, I don't know if you had one last thought to get in. I saw your look of surprise.
Well, if we have to go, we have to go.
No, there's still like 5 minutes.
Just really quick, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about your new book, Alphabet Soup, and what it was like to write it and what it was like to find a home for that book.
Oh, okay. So, so the book is basically, I just started writing down things that my daughters said from when they began to speak. When I started it, I didn't know that there was going to be a book. I mean, I didn't even know that there was going to be a second daughter. And yeah, I would just write it down and I would try to be as exact as possible, which means writing it down immediately. And eventually I was just like, wow, this is like a text. It's almost like a mini novel because it's done over more than a decade and a half. And their characters change. Obviously, their ways of speaking change. And so there's development in it. And then I started looking for a publisher, and initially somebody was interested in publishing it. But it just never happened, and the book kept getting longer and longer. And then a mutual friend of ours, of mine and Ansley's, who is starting his own press, asked me if I wanted to publish it. And I was like, sure. So almost all of the book is just things that my daughters say. And then I have an essay in the back on poetry in children's language. And also a few poems in the back, because a lot of stuff that they said would just go straight into my poems. So I learned a lot about, speaking directly, playing with language, asking questions. Yes, they also supplied the art.
Thank you. I cannot wait to see it and read it.
I guess we have to let Eugene go because he has to go teach on a different Zoom. So we can thank you for your presence. If other people want to hang out for another couple of minutes, we can keep the Zoom going. But we have to let Eugene go.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Ciao.
And
Bye-bye.
if you're in
Later.
San Diego, come by the library at 5 p.m. and hear some more.
Good. Hope to see you there. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Oh my gosh, Ainsley and Amelia, you were both so great. You were great at moderating, and Amelia, I know you're not really the moderator,